Canada, everybody's best friend. Home to breathtaking landscapes, poutine, maple syrup, moose, and the ultimate DILF, Justin Trudeau. Praised for its multicultural attitude and its ability to embrace change, Canada is often seen as a welcome ally to many. But what if its mate America decided they wanted a piece of that maple pie for themselves? What if America wanted to wear its hat? What if America invaded Canada? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. I'm Rebecca Felgate, and today we're imagining a situation where relations between allies Canada and America turn sour and the United States decides to annex his neighbor. Boo! While the thought today seems pretty wild, the United States did try and fail to conquer Canada in 1812. A series of blunders meant that the much bigger American army embarrassingly failed to gain any traction. Then, in the 1920s and 30s, America drew up War Plan Red, which involved America declaring war on Britain and seizing Canada, still part of the British Commonwealth. Of course, this never happened, but the thought was there, and I would imagine, even if it is never admitted to, old plans to invade the North still exist somewhere today in the Pentagon. These days, the American army is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the world. In the States, they have 1.3 million active soldiers and 800,000 in reserve. Canada, well, Canada has 68,000 active soldiers and 27,000 in reserve, so to say that the Canadian is a fraction of the size of the American is a bit of an understatement. Canada falls short of America in almost every single military way, plus America has over 7,000 nuclear weapons.
Do you think America should nuke Canada?
No.
If you nuked Canada, the amazing thing would be the element of surprise. Them would never expect it.
Canada has zero. Throughout the past 100 or so years, Canada's biggest defense has been their friendship with the United States. If America decided to attack Canada, it is more than likely the Canadian army would not and could not put up a fight. Back in the 20s, when America were creating their Plan Red, Canada were devising Defense Scheme Number 1, which acknowledged that a preemptive strike on America would be suicide and their only real options were to retreat or to surrender. The invasion would be swift, but it would not be bloody. America would not want to spill unnecessary Canadian blood, and if there were any targets for explosive weapons, they would be military areas. A sweep of targets from east to west could be easily wrapped up in one day. The easiest entry points would be into Quebec from upper New York State, Vermont, and Maine. Moving into Ontario would be a two-pronged affair from Buffalo and from upper New York into the Canadian capital of Ottawa. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba would be entered from the upper United States of America, with Winnipeg being particularly easy to seize. Entry into Vancouver and the widest British Columbia would be easiest from Seattle, although entry up the Strait of Georgia would be more difficult for the United States Army, with Vancouver Island a good area to defend from. Most of northern Canada will be easily accessed from Alaska, with a strong army base developing in Anchorage. Newfoundland and Labrador could be attacked by the Navy from the sea. It is possible that other countries would consider coming to Canada's defense, most likely the United Kingdom and France, because of the country's historic relationship. But even then, would these two nations want to face the biggest military in the world at a risk of great personal loss of life? Maybe. A third country that may want to get involved is Russia. While Russia has no loyalty to Canada, it may see the opportunity of a distracted United States, as well as the greater threat of an expanded United States of America, which would then become the biggest country in the world. Worldwide politics aside, for the Canadians, after an initial period of upheaval, life would be reasonably similar. Instead of provinces, the land would be divided into states, but cities would remain very much as they were, just with American flags rather than Canadian. At this point, I would imagine Quebec would attempt to dislodge from the country once and for all, with the French divide becoming even more apparent in a colossal United States. The drinking age across the country would be changed from 18 in Quebec and 19 in the rest of Canada to 21. Although the good news is that if you live in Ontario, you may actually be able to buy alcohol in regular stores. A small victory. Canadians would return to the old imperial system, something America clutches onto with a strange defiance. And of course, the money would change to the American dollar, which again may not be the worst thing. Eventually, Canadian culture would bleed in with American, with the quirks Canadians enjoy becoming state things rather than characteristics of national pride. I, for one, living in and loving Canada, think it would be a very sad day. But guys, don't worry, America won't invade Canada. Probably not, anyway. If they did, I am sure the Canadians would still find a way to say sorry about it.
What if America went to war with the rest of the world? That doesn't just include America's enemies, but all of its global allies as well. Would it mean a global disaster? Would it mean the total destruction of America? Or would America prevail? That is exactly what we're going to talk about right now on Life's Biggest Questions. Hello and welcome back to LBQ. Don't forget to like and subscribe and write your topic suggestions in the comments below. If America found itself in a war with the rest of the world, the most logical thing to do would be to pull back and defend itself on its home soil. And using the entire strength of the military, Navy, and Air Force, the US would be able to defend itself for quite some time, possibly until the rest of the world gave up. Keyword, possibly. America's Navy is the biggest in the world. It's so big that the next 8 largest navies combined are nowhere near as powerful or as technologically advanced. So attacking America by sea is not the brightest idea. It's highly unlikely an enemy could get to America by sea. The US also has the strongest and best air force on the planet. It has around 1,400 planes and helicopters. That's a heck of a lot more than everybody else. If there were a war between the US and the rest of the world, the F-22, the world's only 5th-generation fighter, would patrol the continental US on its borders and intercept any enemy bombers that got too close. Missile launchers would also shoot down approaching enemy jets, planes, and missiles. So that rules out an attack by air or sea. Then there's the question of a land invasion. The US Army and Marine Corps has around 9,000 tanks, which are the world's most advanced. If any enemy tanks made it to the mainland, they wouldn't stand a chance. Most of the tanks belonging to other countries are older US and Soviet tanks. They would not be able to last long against American tanks that would be firing behind cover. If all else fails and a handful of enemy troops get past the front lines, they have nowhere to hide. America's combat troops are also the most technologically advanced in the world. Like something out of a sci-fi movie, they have weapon sights that allow them to see enemies through dust and smoke, and even around corners. Engineers for the US Army designed a night vision system that allows the Army to see what's behind a corner, allow them to run up to it, and poke their weapon around the wall to fire at the enemy. Soldiers are protected by advanced protective armor, and it's only getting better. And that's just the technology we know about. That means even if every other military on Earth decided to attack the US, that still wouldn't be enough to defeat the US military. Then there's the question of nuclear weapons. The scenario would be much different if the world decided to use nuclear weapons against the US. 9 of the world's countries possess around 15,000 nuclear weapons. The US was the first country to develop nuclear weapons, and it's the only country to ever have used them. America's arsenal is about 6,800 warheads strong. Russia is in possession of the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. They possess around 7,000 warheads. The United Kingdom has 215, France has 300, China has 270, India around 110, 120, Pakistan 120 to 130, Israel has around 80, and North Korea is believed to have around 10. Many or most of these nuclear weapons are many times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in World War II. If any enemies decide to fire a nuclear weapon at a major US city from somewhere like Canada or Mexico, it could likely be shot down. Navy Trident missiles could be fired from submarines in the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico and Canada would become exposed to radiation from those missiles. Here's where the tides begin to turn. A war of this scale would not come cheap. Yes, the US can withstand offensive attacks for some time, but keeping the war going, that's another problem. America would find itself in a situation like Germany at the end of World War II. No resources, no trade, bankrupt. That would be the opportunity for enemy forces to strike. Russia would strike with Canada from the north, Mexico from the south, Europe from the east, China and North Korea from the west. No country on earth, not even the one with the strongest military, can withstand an attack from all sides with absolutely no allies. So what if America then lost a war against the rest of the world? Well, that sounds like a topic for another Life's Biggest Questions. US-Chinese relations have always been somewhat complicated. Both countries rely on one another economically, but both countries also acknowledge that the other could be a potential adversary. But what if that delicate relationship suddenly became strained? Today, Life's Biggest Questions asks, what if the United States invaded China? Hello and welcome back to LBQ. I'm your host, Charlotte Dobre. As always, make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe and let us know in the comments below what topics you would like to see next. Over the last few years, China's military is becoming more technologically advanced, and it doesn't have obligations to the rest of the world the way America does. China has nuclear capabilities, satellite technology, and military forces on the ground, air, and sea. China China is the world's runner-up for military spending after the United States. According to Abraham Denmark, Senior Vice President for Political and Security Affairs at the Natural Bureau for Asian Research, a war between the US and China would be disastrous for both sides. So in order to invade China, the US would have to have a very good reason. Perhaps if China got into conflict with one of the United States allies, like Japan or South Korea, and the United States would be forced to intervene to defend those countries. But if the United States invaded China without a good enough reason, that would make them the aggressor and effectively a war criminal. And being a war criminal does not put you in the best position when it comes to needing allies. The ability to win the war would depend on the political climate at the time, and which countries would back up the US and which would back up China. If the United States invaded China, it would need to use its current allies that surround China to serve as bases and launch points. And having those allies really close to China also poses a problem. If the US wanted to strike China with a nuclear missile from the mainland, that missile has to fly through the airspace of the surrounding countries. In addition, the fallout from that missile would affect all of the surrounding countries. China has the geographical advantage. In the event that the United States invaded China, China could use nuclear weapons to strategically take out all of the bases that the US requires. It could destroy bases like the port of Yokosuka, the Kadena Air Base, and effectively stop the war in its tracks. If this happens, it would be extremely difficult for the US military to continue an operation. Its aircraft need bases to refuel. America would then have to transport its supplies all the way from mainland America or from Australia. Not to mention, what if India, North Korea, or Russia came to China's defense? Russia could attack the United States from Alaska. Canada would then have to take a side. If they side with America, it's in the middle of a conflict. If it sides with China, a land route opens up for Russian forces. Either way, Canada would have to get involved, and all of a sudden, an American invasion of China becomes a full-fledged world war. A war that the United States would very likely lose. Yes, the United States has the best military the world has ever seen, but you don't always need the best military to win a war. Many historians will say that the first rule of military strategy is to never get involved in a land war in Asia. An invasion of China would be a bloodbath, especially for Chinese civilians and US troops. Millions would die initially, then after the first waves of troops died off, the US would have to send more troops into the bloodbath. It would go on until both countries were so badly wounded, militarily, politically, and economically, that they would be forced to stop. American influence in Asia would surely be strained following a war with China, especially if they had been the aggressor. America would never have the same influence in the East again. What do you think would happen if the US invaded China? Let us know in the comments below.
What if America invaded Russia right now? At the time of writing for this video, the whole world is watching Eastern Europe incredibly carefully as over 100,000 Russian troops have been amassed alongside the eastern border of Ukraine, causing a tidal wave of debate across the globe as to whether Vladimir Putin is actually planning to invade Ukraine or whether this is merely more saber-rattling as Russia attempts to gain concessions from NATO and other Western nations. While many NATO-allied nations have begun making preparations to invoke sanctions against Russia if they continue their aggression, many are waiting to see exactly how committed Putin is to his potential invasion plan. And although American President Joe Biden has claimed that no American troops will be sent into Ukraine in a combat role, is there a possibility that America could invade Russia before Russia can harm Ukraine? The answer is a bit more complicated than you might think. The United States and Russia, formerly known as the Soviet Union, have a long and complicated history as the two biggest superpowers on the global stage following the end of the Second World War. For decades, the two were locked in a Cold War based around their competing ideologies and the growing threat of both sides having a sizable nuclear stockpile. This was the whole reasoning behind the coldness of the Cold War in the first place. Neither side wanted to be the first to use nuclear arms against the other because it would likely lead to mutually assured destruction as both sides would be forced to unleash their salvos of stored nuclear weapons. And while the threat of mutually assured destruction has become much lower since the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia's resurgence as a singular country again, the United States and Russia are still opposed to one another after so many decades of being tense enemies. If America were to suddenly attempt to invade Russia itself, they'd be breaking almost a century's worth of precedent and begin a war that would be the farthest thing from cold foothold, even if nuclear weapons likely wouldn't be invoked. The first issue with the United States of America attempting to invade the Russian mainland is a matter of distance. There's over 7,100 kilometers, or 4,400 miles, between the continental US and the border of Russia, with the Atlantic Ocean and the rest of Europe making up the bulk of that incredibly long distance. Ironically, if America decided to invade from the opposite direction over the Pacific Ocean, they'd have a slightly shorter distance of 6,600 kilometers, or 4,100 miles, but given that the entirety of that distance would be over the ocean, it would be extremely impractical to launch any attacks over such a distance. If the United States wanted to get any actual boots on the ground in Russia, they would likely be forced to rely heavily on Allied military bases throughout Europe and Asia, with tens of thousands of troops already stationed in South Korea and the Persian Gulf countries that could be used to quickly launch an attack on Russia. However, any country that allowed US troops to launch directly from their soil would also risk angering Russia further, and might get pulled into the conflict more heavily than our allies would like. Attacking Russia during the wintertime is notoriously difficult even under ideal circumstances, and having to negotiate a starting base of operations and which countries would be willing to fully engage in war with Russia would be a huge diplomatic hurdle that the United States would have to find a way to deal with. And any countries in the region that aren't necessarily the most friendly with the United States might take issue with the US suddenly rolling thousands of troops and equipment through on their way to Russia, thus causing even more problems than the United States would have to contend with. Now, the main expectation if any actual fighting breaks out in Eastern Europe is that it would mostly center on Ukraine itself, given that Russia's been amassing troops and technology on their border for several months now. However, the United States invading Russia directly would be tremendously unexpected, given how difficult a direct attack on Russia would be, but it might have some advantages to simply fighting within Ukraine. If the United States were able to attack key Russian infrastructure before Russia was fully aware they were being invaded, the United States might be able to take advantage of the fact that many of Russia's troops are currently focused on preparing for their own invasion of Ukraine. The United States likely would need to supply some troops directly to Ukraine to make sure that Russia didn't make their own aggressive move in the area, but their main focus would be getting as many special forces and tactical units into Russia as undetected as possible. However, in a world of 5G internet and satellite surveillance, getting armed troops into a country without being detected is far easier said than done. Furthermore, while Russia's defenses wouldn't be at their peak due to 100,000 troops being actively involved in preparing for invasion on Ukraine's borders, this still leaves 750,000 active members in the Russian military that could be called upon to fall back and defend the country if an American attack were to suddenly take place or an American invasion attempted. The United States would need to commit an absolutely massive amount of troops, equipment, and technology if it wanted to have any hope of securing a foothold on even the very edge of Russian territory, which would be made all the more difficult by the fact that much of this equipment would need to be airlifted, utilizing the entirety of the US Air Force's transportation forces simply to get anything noteworthy on the ground. Combine this with the active threat that would be posed to any American aircraft by Russian defenses and rockets, and you have a situation that could snowball into disaster and stranded American troops incredibly quickly. The United States might currently have 1.3 million active personnel in their military, but that large number would mean nothing when it comes to an invasion if they couldn't safely get those troops within firing distance of Russia. Combined with anti-war and support the troops sentiments conflicting at home, and the United States might have a lot more to lose from an outright invasion of Russia than it would ever have to gain. At the end of the day, the situation going on in Eastern Europe with Russia and Ukraine is a very serious one, and it's a situation that we can only hope won't result in bloodshed or the loss of further land for the Ukraine people. While a full-out invasion of Russia committed by the United States is an extremely unlikely possibility given the current tactics being used by NATO members and Joe Biden's commitment to not using American troops for combat during this standoff, it's still an interesting possibility to think can talk about and wonder just how such a radical plan would play out.
Can America go to war with the world? It might seem like this should be a simple black and white answer, but the United States is an absolute powerhouse, and there's a lot of things we need to consider. The United States is a bold and brave country, and sometimes there are things that happen there that make the world sit and wonder, but the United States is not insane. If the United States was entering a war with the rest of the world, it is unlikely that they would be declaring war on every other person in the world. I mean, even just trying to invade every continent would leave American forces pretty thin, so to think of America trying to invade every country? The world is just too big. There simply isn't enough manpower in America. It is much more likely that the world would be turning on the United States. But why? America has some pretty good allies, i.e. Canada, and I can't see a conceivable reason why we would ever turn on them. I mean, I'm a Canadian and I love being a Canadian, but I am very much willing to recognize the support and the protection that we receive from the United States. Of course, we help with resources and such, but the relationship is certainly mutually beneficial. There are many countries which I'm sure would love to wage war on the United States, but everyone recognizes the power that the United States holds, so it just doesn't make sense to do it. Likelihood, or rather the lack thereof I suppose, doesn't matter when we are talking about a hypothetical question, so let's say some insane circumstances have arisen and the whole world has in fact decided to declare war on the United States. If nuclear weapons are involved, well, we all know what would happen. The outcome would be that the entire world would suffer as a result of that. If the United States is going down in a nuclear meltdown, you better believe that they're going to get in some good blows before they go down. With the use of nuclear weapons, it is most likely that the United States would be defeated because none of us really stand a chance when it comes to nuclear power. That is not a commentary on the strength of the United States, but rather a commentary on the power of nuclear weapons. The rest of the world would be in terrible shape, and we'd probably all be in a scenario after where we find ourselves asking why. Was it worth it? Probably not. In a war between the United States and everyone else, I don't think nuclear weapons would be used, however. If for anything, because of the fact that there are countries on either side of the United States who would be involved in that everyone else, who would probably have some issues with their next door neighbor getting a lethal dose of nuclear radiation. I mean, you're just asking for a whole slew of issues to arise. It would be insane for either Canada or Mexico to be on board with that plan, and if the rest of the world just went on with it anyway, it's unlikely that the United States would then be alone in their fight against the world. If the use of nuclear weapons was not involved in this war, things would definitely be different, and the fight would be much more interesting. The United States is not an easy country to invade, and that is really one of the only ways that they could be fully defeated. We just talked about how the United States is bordered by two countries, Mexico and Canada, and then it is also bordered by two rather large bodies of water known as the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This is where there would be plenty of issues with the invasion. Trying to come in by sea is a non-starter. The United States has the most intimidating oceanic forces the world has ever seen. There are of course other very well-equipped countries in terms of naval battle, but the United States would very quickly turn into an impenetrable firewall. Not to mention the strength of the Coast Guard, who would ensure the safety of the United States mainland. What's the opposite of invasion by sea? Well, of course, invasion by air. This is another course that might have better outcomes for those trying to invade the United States, but it truly wouldn't be a walk in the park if the world was able to successfully invade this way. Here's the thing though. You'd have to get past the North American Aerospace Defense Command. I know it's possible that this wouldn't exist anymore considering the rest of North America is now turning on the United States, but still, let's think logistically. You're gonna have to get past whatever defense exists enough to land the plane and then drop all of the troops, and then do this enough times that there's enough troops to overpower those living in the United States. It just doesn't make any sense. Any plane trying to enter would immediately be shot down, and if by whatever miracle they were able to land and drop off troops, those forces would immediately be tracked, found, and eliminated. And you're not only fighting against the United States military and all of their forces, you're fighting against United States citizens and United States veterans. So, once we realize that air and sea are most likely not our best options, we have the land neighbors next to the United States to consider. Well, the United States is the most powerful country in the world, and neither Mexico or Canada are even in the top 3, so it is truly most likely that the United States would have a fairly easy time capturing both. The United States would quickly capture Mexico. From here, they would create some sort of a choke point near the Guatemalan border, most likely. Or if the United States was feeling up to it, they could occupy further and put that choke point at the Darien Gap. This would require more resources in order to seize more land, but this would be the most ideal place to put up defenses and stop an invasion. Canada might be a place that puts up a bit more resistance, there might be a bigger fight and more casualties, but we are still no match for the United States, and we would likely be captured as well. The United States already has Alaska, which would put a border up against Russia, as well as give the opportunity for the United States to be capturing Canada from more than one angle. Canada has a vast border and a lot of land space, but we are not a highly populated country, so standing up to the manpower, the economic power, and the resources that the United States have just isn't a feasible option. At this point, the United States has, well, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and potentially even all of Central America and the Caribbean, which puts them in a good position. But is it enough to overpower the rest of the world still? Well, it depends what happens from here. Do the countries that the United States has captured begin pursuing peace with the United States? Because that would certainly help the US in their victory. If not, it is likely that the United States wouldn't be able to defeat the world, although they would put up one hell of a fight. The bottom line here is that, regardless of who technically wins this war, it's a lose-lose situation for all. If the countries that the United States captured try to pursue peace and offer deals, it is definitely possible that the United States could feasibly win. There of course would be decades of recovery after, and it is unclear whether the United States would emerge from the war still as one of the world's leading powers, but it is a possibility. Stranger things have happened. Alright guys, that has been our video for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up button if you enjoyed it today, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more. Stay curious, LBQ fam, and I'll see you on the next one.